Marble floors and crystal chandeliers fill most of the Rossetti mansion. But down a forgotten hallway on the north wing, behind a door nobody used, there was a room with a cracked ceiling, a broken window, and cold that settled into your bones no matter the season. That was the room they gave Josie Calloway on her wedding night. They thought it would break her. Instead, she picked up a paintbrush. The morning of her wedding, Josie Calloway stood in front of a cracked bathroom mirror in her childhood home, buttoning a dress that wasn't the one she had dreamed about as a little girl. It was ivory, elegant, and entirely borrowed. Her mother had rented it from a boutique 3 towns over, the kind of place that didn't ask questions when a bride needed a dress for a wedding that would happen in 9 days instead of 9 months. Josie's hands were steady as she smoothed the fabric over her hips. That steadiness surprised her. She had expected to be shaking. Instead, she just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything soft inside her and left behind a girl who knew how to survive. Her father's construction company had been bleeding money for 3 years. Bad contracts, a partner who disappeared with half the operating capital, a recession that hit small builders hardest. Walter Calloway had done what desperate men in over their heads sometimes did. He borrowed from people who didn't send polite letters when payments were late. He borrowed from the Rossetti family. By the time Josie found out, the debt had swollen past anything her father could ever repay with honest work. $2 million, give or take the interest that compounded like a slow bleed. She remembered the night her father sat at their kitchen table, his face gray, and told her there was a way out. Dante Rossetti, the head of the family, was unmarried. He wanted a wife who understood how to keep a house, who wouldn't ask questions, who would give the appearance of a stable, respectable life to a man whose business required exactly that kind of appearance. In exchange, the debt would be forgiven, every cent. "You don't have to say yes," her father had told her, his voice cracking in a way she'd never heard before. "I would rather lose the house than lose you to a man like that." But Josie had looked at her mother's trembling hands, at the foreclosure notice folded into a kitchen drawer like it was something shameful, and she had said yes anyway. Not because she was brave, because somebody in her family had to be the one who didn't run. The ceremony was small, quiet, and entirely business. It took place in a private chapel on the Rossetti estate, attended by men in dark suits who watched the proceedings with the flat, patient expressions of people counting minutes until they could return to more important matters. Dante Rossetti stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, his dark hair combed back, his jaw set in the permanent, unreadable line of a man who had learned young never to let his face give anything away. He didn't smile when she walked down the aisle. He didn't reach for her hand until the priest instructed him to. When their eyes finally met, Josie searched his face for anything: cruelty, indifference, even curiosity. She found nothing. He looked at her the way a man might look at a contract he was about to sign, thorough, careful, and entirely without warmth. "You may kiss the bride," the priest said. Dante leaned down and brushed his lips against her cheek instead. It was the first small mercy of the day, and Josie clung to it the way a drowning person clings to driftwood. After the ceremony, there was no reception, no dancing, no cutting of a cake. A black car took her from the chapel straight to the mansion, a sprawling gray stone estate on the edge of the city that looked more like a fortress than a home. Cameras tracked the car's progress up the long gravel driveway. Men in dark clothes nodded as they passed through 2 sets of gates. Inside, the mansion was breathtaking in the coldest possible way. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers. The walls were hung with oil paintings of Rossetti ancestors whose stern faces seemed to judge her for existing. Everything smelled like lemon polish and money. An older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled into a tight bun met them in the foyer. She introduced herself as Rosa, the housekeeper, and gave Josie a look that was somewhere between pity and warning. "I'll show you to your room," Rosa said, already turning toward the staircase. Josie glanced at Dante, half expecting him to walk with her, to say something, anything, about the life they were now supposed to share. He was already turning toward his study, a folder tucked under his arm, his mind clearly somewhere else entirely. "Dinner is at 8, he said without looking back. "Rosa will show you where." And that was it. That was her wedding night. Rosa led her up 2 flights of stairs and down a long corridor that grew progressively darker, the chandeliers giving way to plain wall sconces, the plush carpet giving way to bare, scuffed wood. They passed a dozen closed doors before Rosa finally stopped in front of one at the very end of the hall, tucked into a corner where 2 wings of the house met at an awkward angle. "This is yours," Rosa said, and there was something careful in the way she said it, like she was bracing herself for a reaction. Josie pushed the door open. The room hit her with cold air first, a draft that had no business existing indoors. The single window was cracked along one corner, a jagged fracture that let the November wind whistle through. The wallpaper had peeled away in long, curling strips, revealing water stains beneath, the yellow-brown blooms of old damage that had never been repaired. A crack ran along the ceiling like a lightning bolt frozen mid-strike. There was no bed frame, just a bare mattress pushed against the wall, its edges gray with age. No dresser, no chair, no rug to soften the cold hardwood floor. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, and when Josie reached for the switch, it flickered twice before deciding to stay on. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it in. It was, without question, the worst room in the entire house. "This was the old servants' quarters," Rosa said quietly, as if that explained everything. "Nobody has used it in years." "I see," Josie said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Rosa hesitated at the door, her sharp eyes softening for just a moment. "There are better rooms in the East Wing, Mrs. Rossetti. I don't know why he chose this one for you." Mrs. Rossetti. The name landed strange in Josie's ears, a title that didn't belong to her yet, might never truly belong to her. "It's fine," Josie said, though it very clearly was not fine. "Thank you, Rosa." Rosa gave her one last look, the kind of look that carried an apology it couldn't voice, and then she was gone, her footsteps fading back down the corridor. Josie closed the door and sat down on the edge of the bare mattress. The springs groaned beneath her. Cold air pressed against her back through the cracked window, and somewhere deep in the walls, pipes clanked and hissed like the house itself was complaining about her presence. She could have cried. Some quiet, exhausted part of her wanted to, but crying required a kind of surrender she wasn't ready to give, not to this house, not to the man who had put her in it, not to a life she never asked for. So instead, she pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapped her arms around them, and stared at the crack in the ceiling until her eyes adjusted to the dark. She thought about her mother's trembling hands. She thought about the debt that no longer hung over her family's heads. She thought, stubbornly, defiantly, that a cold room was a small price to pay for the people she loved. It was just a room, she told herself. Rooms could be fixed. She had no idea, that first freezing night, how true that thought would turn out to be. The first week passed in a blur of silence and careful navigation. Josie learned the house the way a person learns a minefield, memorizing which staircases creaked, which hallways were watched by men with earpieces, which doors she wasn't meant to open. She ate dinner across a table so long from Dante that conversation felt like shouting across a canyon. Most nights, he didn't come to dinner at all, and Rosa would set a single plate for her at one end of the vast dining table, the emptiness of the chair across from her louder than any words could have been. Dante Rossetti was, By every account Josie gathered from the careful, hushed comments of the staff, a man who ran his family's business with the same cold precision he ran everything else. He left before dawn most mornings, returned late into the night, and spent the hours in between locked in his study with men who spoke in low voices and left through side doors. He was polite to her in the rare moments they crossed paths, in the way a man is polite to a stranger sharing an elevator, but there was a wall behind his eyes that never came down. She didn't try to climb it. She had enough of her own walls to maintain. At night, she lay awake in the freezing room, listening to the wind find every gap in the old window frame, and she began, almost without meaning to catalog the room's failures. The crack in the ceiling, the peeling wallpaper, the bare bulb that buzzed faintly when it was on, the complete absence of anything that might make a space feel lived in. On the 8th morning, she woke up with her breath visible in the air and made a decision. She found Rosa in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough, and asked the question that had been forming in her mind since that first cold night. "Is there a hardware store nearby? Somewhere I could buy paint, maybe some basic tools." Rosa looked up, flour dusting her hands, and studied Josie for a long moment. "You want to fix the room yourself?" "I don't see anyone else offering," Josie said, and there was no bitterness in it, just fact. Something shifted in Rosa's expression, a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. "There's a shop in town, hardware and paint both. I can have Pietro drive you, if Mr. Rossetti allows it." "Does Mr. Rossetti need to allow it?" Rosa's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile Josie had seen from her. "In this house, Mrs. Rossetti, everything requires his allowance, but I don't think he'll object to paint." He didn't. When Rosa mentioned it to him in passing that evening, Dante barely looked up from the documents spread across his desk. "Whatever she needs," he said, already turning the page. "Put it on the account." It wasn't warmth. It wasn't even real attention, but it was permission, and Josie took it. Pietro, the mansion's aging groundskeeper, drove her into town the next morning in a truck that smelled like cut grass and motor oil. He didn't say much, but he helped her load bags of spackle, sandpaper, drop cloths, and paint samples into the truck bed without being asked, and when she thanked him, he just nodded like it was the most natural thing in the world. The hardware store owner, a heavy-set man named Carl who clearly had no idea who she'd married, spent 40 minutes helping her pick out the right paint for old plaster walls, the right compound for cracked ceilings, the kind of practical, unglamorous knowledge nobody had ever bothered teaching her growing up. Josie soaked it in like water in dry soil. "You sure you want to do this yourself?" Carl asked as he rang up her purchases. "We do have contractors who could come out." "I'm sure," Josie said, and for the first time since her wedding day, something in her chest loosened just slightly. "I want to do it myself." She started that same afternoon, before she could talk herself out of it. She pushed the bare mattress into the center of the room, covered the floor with drop cloths, and stood in front of the cracked wall with a tub of spackle and a putty knife she barely knew how to use. It was messier than she expected. The first few attempts at smoothing the compound over the cracks left the wall looking worse, not better. Thick, uneven ridges where there should have been seamless plaster. She wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of white dust behind, and tried again. By the time the light outside faded to dusk, her arms ached and her knees were sore from kneeling, but the worst of the cracks along the far wall had been filled and smoothed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to professional. But it was hers, every uneven stroke of it, and there was something fiercely satisfying in that. Rosa found her there that evening, sitting cross-legged on a drop cloth, surveying her work with tired satisfaction. "You missed dinner," Rosa said, though her tone wasn't scolding. "I lost track of time," Josie admitted. Rosa's eyes moved over the room, the freshly patched wall, the paint cans lined up neatly against the baseboard, the careful order Josie had brought to what had been neglect. "You have your grandmother's hands," Rosa said unexpectedly. "My grandmother could fix anything: furniture, plumbing, a broken heart. She said a person who knows how to fix things is never truly powerless." Josie looked down at her own hands, dust-caked and slightly raw. "I like that idea." "I'll bring you a plate," Rosa said, already turning toward the door. "You'll need your strength for tomorrow. That ceiling crack isn't going to fix itself." Over the following days, the room began, slowly, stubbornly, to transform. Josie painted the walls a warm cream color she'd chosen from Carl's sample cards, something that would catch the afternoon light and hold on to it instead of swallowing it the way the old gray plaster had. She spent an entire Saturday up on a wobbly ladder, patching the crack in the ceiling until it disappeared beneath a fresh coat of white. She fixed the window herself, watching an online video 3 times before she trusted her hands enough to replace the cracked pane, sealing the frame with weather stripping until the draft that had haunted her first night finally, blessedly, stopped. Word seemed to travel through the house the way it always does in places where people have little else to talk about. One afternoon, she found a small stack of second-hand furniture catalogs left outside her door. No note, no explanation. She never found out who left them, though she had her suspicions about Rosa. She spent her modest allowance carefully, hunting through estate sales and second-hand shops for pieces that had character instead of price tags that matched the rest of the mansion's cold opulence. She found a wooden dresser with hand-carved drawer pulls, scuffed but solid, and spent an entire evening sanding it down and refinishing it until the wood glowed warm honey brown. She found a faded quilt at a church rummage sale, hand-stitched by someone decades ago, its patchwork squares soft with age, and she draped it over the bed frame she'd finally convinced Pietro to help her carry up from the mansion's forgotten storage room. Every evening after her chores in the house were done, tasks Rosa had gently started teaching her, not because she was required to, but because Josie had asked. She disappeared into her room and worked. Sanding, painting, arranging, rearranging. It became a kind of meditation, the only hours of the day that felt entirely her own. She barely saw Dante during any of it. He remained a distant, formal presence in the house, a set of footsteps in the hallway late at night, a closed study door, a name the staff spoke with careful respect. Their few interactions were brief and businesslike. He asked once, in passing, if she had everything she needed. She said yes, and he nodded and moved on, apparently satisfied by the simplicity of her answer. If he noticed the sound of hammering coming from the north wing, the faint smell of paint that occasionally drifted through the house, he never mentioned it. Josie told herself she didn't care whether he noticed. She was doing this for herself, not for him. But some small, quiet part of her, the part she tried hardest to ignore, couldn't help wondering what it would take to make the man behind that closed study door look at her the way he looked at the paperwork he seemed to love more than anything else in his life. It took nearly 6 weeks before Dante Rossetti set foot in her room. It happened by accident, or at least that was how it seemed at the time. Josie had been coming down with a cold. Nothing serious, just a scratchy throat and heavy eyes that made the day drag longer than usual. She'd gone to bed early, and sometime past midnight, a service call about a security breach at one of the family's warehouses had Dante moving briskly down the north wing corridor, a route he rarely took, toward a staff phone that had stopped working days ago and that nobody had bothered to report. He passed her door, saw the thin line of warm light beneath it, and paused. It was the light that stopped him, she would learn later. Not curiosity about her, not any softening toward the marriage he'd arranged like a business transaction, just simple confusion. That room had been dark and unused for as long as he could remember. He hadn't expected light. He knocked, more out of habit than genuine consideration, and when she called out a groggy, "Come in," he pushed the door open, expecting the same broken, forgotten space he'd assigned her out of thoughtless efficiency 6 weeks earlier. What he found instead stopped him cold. The walls glowed warm cream in the lamplight. A patchwork quilt lay neatly over a bed frame that hadn't existed when he'd last glanced into this room, years ago, before he'd even inherited the house from his father. A small wooden desk sat beneath the window, which no longer whistled with drafts, its surface scattered with paint swatches and a half-finished sketch of curtain patterns. Fresh flowers, cut from the garden Pietro tended, sat in a chipped ceramic vase on the dresser, their petals bright against the soft light. The bare bulb was gone, replaced by a simple paper lantern that cast the whole room in a gentle amber glow. It looked, more than anything else in his entire, enormous, echoing house, like somewhere a person actually lived. Dante stood in the doorway, momentarily forgetting why he'd come down this corridor at all. Josie sat up in bed, blinking sleep and mild embarrassment from her eyes, suddenly aware of how she must look. Hair mussed, an old college sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder, tissues balled up on the nightstand from her scratchy throat. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep and the beginnings of a cold. Dante's eyes moved slowly around the room again, taking in details he was still struggling to reconcile with the space he remembered. "I was looking for the staff phone," he said finally. "It's broken. I forgot this hallway had one." "It's fine," Josie said, pulling the quilt up a little higher. "I haven't seen it working since I got here either." He nodded, but he didn't leave. His gaze kept catching on small things. The dresser with its carved handles, clearly refinished by hand. The uneven but carefully painted trim around the window. A small framed photograph on the nightstand, the only personal item in the whole room. A picture of Josie with an older man and woman, who Dante assumed were her parents. All three of them laughing at something outside the frame. "You did all this yourself?" he asked. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a statement either. It hovered somewhere between disbelief and something else he didn't have a name for yet. "Rosa helped me find a paint shop," Josie said. "Pietro drove me and carried the heavy things, but yes, mostly myself." "This was the coldest room in the house," Dante said slowly, as if working through a puzzle. "The pipes freeze in here every winter. My father used it to store nothing, because nothing wanted to be stored in it." "I noticed," Josie said dryly. "I fixed the window. It doesn't draft anymore." Something crossed Dante's face then, quick and complicated, gone before Josie could fully read it. Guilt, maybe. Or something quieter than guilt. "I didn't think about which room I put you in," he admitted. It cost him something to say it. She could see that in the tight line of his jaw, the way his eyes dropped briefly to the floor before returning to hers. "I had a great deal on my mind that week. It wasn't an excuse, just an explanation." "You could apologize," Josie said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "That's usually how these things work." The corner of Dante's mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to be startling on a face that rarely allowed itself softness. "I'm not in the habit of apologizing, Mrs. Rossetti." "Josie," she corrected, before she could stop herself. "If we're going to be married, you can at least use my name." He considered that for a moment, his dark eyes steady on hers in a way that made her suddenly very aware of her own heartbeat. "Josie," he repeated, testing the shape of it. "I'm sorry about the room." It wasn't a large apology. It wasn't flowery or drawn out, but it was real. She could tell that much, and something in her chest loosened at the sound of it. "It's a good room now," she said simply. "It just needed some attention." Dante's eyes swept the space one more time, lingering on the small, careful details that added up to something he hadn't expected to feel standing in a doorway at 1 in the morning. Warmth, not just from the room, but from whatever it revealed about the woman who'd built it, patiently, alone, without complaint, without asking him for anything at all. "Good night, Josie," he said finally, stepping back into the hallway. "Good night," she said, and after he'd gone, she lay back against her pillow and stared at the ceiling she'd patched with her own hands, smiling, despite the scratch in her throat, for reasons she didn't entirely want to examine. After that night, small things began to shift, quietly, the way ice begins to thaw before anyone notices the season has changed. Dante started appearing at dinner more often. Their conversations remained careful at first, mostly practical, the state of the house, small updates about staff, questions about whether she needed anything from town. But gradually, almost without either of them acknowledging it, the conversations grew longer. He asked about her family. She told him about her father's construction business, about the summers she'd spent as a teenager helping him measure lumber and mix concrete, skills she'd never expected to use again, until a broken window in a cold room gave her the excuse. "That explains the spackle," Dante said one evening, something like amusement in his voice. "You knew what you were doing." "Mostly," Josie admitted. "I learned some of it from my dad, the rest from a very patient man named Carl at the hardware store." "I should send him something," Dante said, and Josie couldn't tell if he was joking. He started noticing things about the house he'd never paid attention to before, things Josie had quietly begun improving beyond just her own room. A cracked tile in the hallway bathroom that she'd asked Pietro's nephew to fix. A stiff door hinge in the library she'd oiled herself after growing tired of its complaining. Small repairs, unglamorous and unasked for, scattered through a house that had been slowly falling into elegant neglect for years, its owner too consumed by business to notice the cracks forming in his own walls. "You're fixing my whole house," Dante said one Sunday afternoon, finding her on her knees in the conservatory, re-caulking a leaking window seal while Rosa's radio played faintly from the kitchen down the hall. "Somebody should," Josie said, not looking up from her work. "This place has good bones. It just needs someone to pay attention to it." Dante crouched down beside her, close enough that she could smell the faint cedar of his cologne beneath the mustier smell of old caulk and dust. "Is that a metaphor, Josie Calloway?" "Rossetti," she corrected, glancing sideways at him. "And maybe. Is it working?" He laughed then, a real laugh, low and startled, like it had escaped before he could catch it. It was the first time she'd heard the sound, and it did something strange and warm to her chest. "It's working," he admitted. Not everyone in the Rossetti household welcomed the changes as easily as Rosa and Pietro had. Dante's cousin, Marco, had grown up half expecting to inherit some portion of the family's influence himself, and he made no secret of his opinion that Dante's marriage was, at best, an unnecessary complication, and at worst, a liability dressed in borrowed ivory silk. Marco visited the estate often that first winter, always arriving with a leather folder full of business documents and a way of looking at Josie that made her feel like an itemized expense rather than a person. "You're wasting good stone on her," Marco said one afternoon, not quite quietly enough, as Josie carried a bucket of joint compound past the study where he and Dante were reviewing shipping contracts. "A room like that could have gone to storage, or to someone who understood what it means to actually belong here." Josie didn't stop walking, though her grip on the bucket handle tightened. "Marco," Dante said, his voice carrying the low, warning edge she'd only heard directed at other people until now. "I'm only saying what half the men on this property are thinking," Marco pressed. "You married a girl to cover a debt. Now she's tearing apart the north wing like she's planning to stay forever." "She is staying forever," Dante said. "That was the arrangement." "An arrangement isn't a marriage." Josie set the bucket down in the hallway, just out of sight of the study door, and found she didn't have it in her to keep walking. She'd spent her whole life being talked about instead of talked to, first by creditors discussing her father's failing business over her head, now by a man in an expensive suit discussing her worth to a family she'd been handed to like collateral. She was tired of being a subject instead of a person in the room. She stepped into the doorway. "I can hear you," she said, and both men turned. Marco had the decency to look faintly embarrassed. Dante's expression was harder to read, somewhere between apology and something fiercer underneath it. "Mrs. Calloway," Marco started. "Rossetti," Josie corrected, the way she'd corrected Dante himself months earlier. "And you're right that I didn't grow up understanding what it means to belong to a family like this one. I grew up understanding what it means to fix things other people gave up on. My father's business went under because he trusted the wrong men and couldn't stop the bleeding fast enough. I watched him lose almost everything and keep showing up to work anyway, because a person who stops trying to fix what's broken is the same as a person who's already lost." Marco opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I didn't ask for this marriage," Josie continued, her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. "But I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to apologize for making a room in this house livable. If that bothers you, that's a conversation you can have with your cousin. It doesn't need my bucket of joint compound to referee it." She picked the bucket back up and walked on down the hall, leaving a silence behind her that felt, for the first time since she'd arrived at the estate, like something she'd won rather than something she'd survived. Later that evening, Dante found her in the north wing, scraping old caulk from around the bathroom sink with more force than the job strictly required. "Marco won't bother you again," he said from the doorway. "I wasn't worried about Marco," Josie said, not looking up. "I know," Dante said, and there was something almost like admiration in his voice. That's the part that surprised him. Most people in this house learn very quickly to be worried about Marco. Josie finally glanced up at him, her hands still dusted with old caulk. "I spent 3 years watching my father get talked down to by men who thought money made them smarter than him. I'm not scared of a leather folder and a bad attitude." Dante crossed the room and crouched beside her, taking the scraper gently from her hand and setting it down before she wore a blister into her palm. "For what it's worth," he said, "you are exactly the kind of person this family needed and never had the sense to look for." "Careful," Josie said, though her voice had softened. That almost sounded like a compliment. "It was," Dante said simply, and for once he didn't look away when she smiled at him. Over the following weeks, Dante began finding reasons to walk the North Wing corridor more often than any staff phone repair could justify. He started bringing her small things, not expensive gifts, nothing that felt like the transactional gestures of their arrangement, but practical, thoughtful items. A proper toolbox, sturdy and well-made, to replace the mismatched collection she'd been borrowing from Pietro. A set of paintbrushes finer than the ones from Carl's store. A box of old photographs he found in storage, images of the mansion from decades earlier, back when his grandmother had filled it with furniture and warmth before the family's business had swallowed every soft edge of the place. "My grandmother decorated most of this house," he told her one evening, spreading the photographs across the dining table between them. "After she passed, my father let it all go cold. He said sentiment was a weakness in this business. I believed him for a long time." Josie studied the faded photograph of a much younger version of the mansion, sunlight pouring through windows that were now perpetually curtained, flowers on every surface, laughter frozen in the grain of an old photograph. "I don't think it's weakness," she said quietly. "I think it's the opposite. It takes strength to make a hard place soft. Anyone can let things fall apart. It's harder to keep them standing." Dante was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving between the photograph and her face. "My father would have disagreed with you." "Your father isn't the one who has to live here," Josie said gently. "You are." Something shifted in his expression then, something that had been locked away for so long it seemed to surprise even him when it stirred. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that the space between them felt charged with something neither of them was ready to name. "Thank you," he said. "For fixing the room. For fixing all of it." "I'm not finished yet," Josie said, and there was a promise in it that went beyond wallpaper and window seals. Winter deepened around the mansion, and where the cold had once seeped through every crack in Josie's forgotten room, now warmth radiated from it instead, both literal and otherwise. She'd found a small cast-iron stove at an estate sale 2 towns over, and after Pietro helped her install proper venting, the room held heat through even the harshest nights. She'd hung curtains she'd sewn herself from soft blue fabric, imperfect stitches and all, and they caught the morning light in a way that made the whole space feel like sunrise even on gray days. It was, by any measure, a completely different room than the one she'd first walked into on her wedding night. But more than that, it had become a different kind of space entirely, not just a bedroom in someone else's house, but the first place that had ever truly felt like hers. Dante began spending time there in the evenings, at first with the thin excuse of checking on the stove installation, then without any excuse at all. He would sit in the worn armchair she'd reupholstered herself, a glass of wine forgotten in his hand, and watch her work on whatever small project currently held her attention, a new set of curtain rings, a shelf she was sanding down for a stack of paperback novels she'd started collecting. "You could just buy new things," he said one night, watching her carefully strip old varnish from a small side table she'd found abandoned in the mansion's attic. "You know that. My accounts are more than capable of furnishing this entire wing with anything you want." "I know," Josie said, not looking up from her work. "But then it wouldn't be mine. It would just be expensive." Dante considered that, turning the wine glass slowly in his hand. "There's a difference?" "A big one," Josie said. "Anyone can buy a home. It takes work to build one." He was quiet for a while after that, watching the careful, patient rhythm of her hands against the old wood. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped into something softer than his usual careful control. "My family built everything we have on fear," he said. "Debts collected, territory defended, alliances made because people were afraid of what happened if they said no. I've spent my whole life building things that way. It never occurred to me there might be another kind of building." Josie set down her sandpaper and looked at him fully, taking in the rare, unguarded honesty on his face. "There's always another way to build something, Dante. It's just usually slower, and it usually costs more of yourself than money ever could." "Is that what you're doing?" he asked. "Building something slower?" "I'm trying," she said. "I don't know yet what it's going to look like when it's finished." He set his wineglass down on the small table beside the armchair and stood, crossing the room to where she knelt on the floor amid curls of old varnish and sawdust. He crouched in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head up to meet his eyes, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "I think," Dante said slowly, "it already looks like something worth having." Josie's breath caught, and whatever she might have said in response was interrupted by the sharp ring of a phone from down the hall, one of the mansion's endless business calls that seemed to arrive at exactly the wrong moment. Dante's jaw tightened, the careful, guarded businessman sliding back over his features like a curtain drawn shut. "I have to take that," he said, rising to his feet, though he lingered a moment longer than necessary, his hand brushing lightly over her shoulder before he left the room. Josie sat alone amid her half-finished project, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with sawdust or varnish, and allowed herself, for the first time since her wedding day, to hope that the life she'd been forced into might yet become one she chose for herself. The trouble arrived, as trouble in Dante Rossetti's world always seemed to, without warning. It came in the form of Gio Falcone, a rival family's representative who arrived at the mansion under the pretense of a business meeting, but whose eyes lingered too long, too calculating, on the details of the house, the staff, and eventually, on Josie herself, when she crossed the foyer on her way to the garden. Josie didn't think much of it at the time. A stranger's assessing glance was hardly unusual in a house full of men who measured everything by its worth. But that evening, Dante found her in her room, his expression tighter than she'd seen it in weeks, the careful warmth that had grown between them replaced by something colder, more guarded. "I need you to be careful for the next few weeks," he said without preamble, standing stiffly in her doorway like he'd forgotten how to simply enter a room that had become, in every way that mattered, partly his own. "What happened?" Josie asked, setting down the book she'd been reading. "The Falcones are testing boundaries," Dante said. "They want territory we control near the harbor. Men like Gio Falcone, when they can't win through business, sometimes look for other pressure points." Josie's stomach tightened, understanding arriving slowly, unwelcome. "You mean me?" "I mean anyone I might care about," Dante said, and the honesty in the admission seemed to cost him something. "I should have told you the risks of this life more clearly before now. I let myself forget them because being here, with you, made it easy to forget." "So what do we do?" Josie asked, and she noticed, with a small flicker of pride, that her voice didn't shake. "You stay close to the house for a while," Dante said. "Extra security, though I'll try to keep it from feeling like a cage. And you tell me, immediately, if anything feels wrong. Anyone lingering too long near the gates, any car you don't recognize on the road into town." Josie nodded, though something in her chest ached at the thought of the careful freedom she'd built for herself, shrinking suddenly back down under threat. Over the following days, the mansion's usual quiet efficiency sharpened into something more vigilant. Extra men appeared at the gates. Pietro, usually content pruning roses and driving her into town, now carried himself with the alert posture of someone watching for more than weeds. Dante came home earlier than usual, though the tension he carried never fully left his shoulders, a low hum of vigilance that Josie could feel even across the length of the dinner table. It was Josie, in the end, who noticed the unfamiliar car parked at the edge of the property line, half hidden by the tree line where the estate's fence gave way to public road. She'd been walking back from the garden with a basket of cut flowers when she spotted it, a dark sedan idling too long in a spot that had no reasonable purpose for idling. She didn't panic. She didn't run for the house dramatically, the way she might have imagined herself doing in the earliest, most frightened days of her marriage. Instead, she walked calmly, deliberately, back toward the mansion, found Pietro near the greenhouse, and told him quietly what she'd seen. Within minutes, the property's security had converged toward the sedan, and by the time Dante arrived home that evening, the car was long gone, though the license plate Pietro had memorized led to a name Dante recognized immediately as one of Gio Falcone's associates. "You did exactly the right thing," Dante told her later that night, sitting across from her in the armchair she'd reupholstered, his relief evident in the way his shoulders finally loosened after a day of tension. "You didn't panic. You told the right person. That matters more than you know." "I've spent my whole life learning how to stay calm when things fall apart," Josie said quietly. "My father's business taught me that, if nothing else." Dante was quiet for a moment, studying her with an expression she was slowly learning to read, admiration, tangled with something warmer underneath it. "I underestimated you," he admitted. "When my men first told me about your family, about the debt, I saw a solution to a problem, a convenient arrangement. I never imagined I'd find someone who could stand steady in the middle of my world without flinching." "I flinch plenty," Josie said honestly. "I just don't let it stop me." "That," Dante said, "might be the same thing as courage." The tension with the Falcone family resolved itself over the following weeks through channels Josie was mostly kept apart from. Quiet negotiations, territorial concessions, the kind of careful business maneuvering that kept blood from being spilled on either side. Dante never gave her every detail, and she understood, without needing it explained, that some parts of his world would always remain behind a door she wasn't meant to open. But he did tell her, when it was finally resolved, that the harbor dispute was settled, that Gio Falcone's interest in pressuring the Rossetti family through its softer edges had cooled considerably once it became clear how carefully those edges were now being protected. "They know now that hurting you would cost them more than any harbor is worth," Dante told her, and there was something fierce beneath the careful calm of his voice, something that told her exactly how much that protection meant to him, even if he wasn't yet ready to name it outright. Spring arrived slowly at the Rossetti estate, the way it always seems to arrive slowly in old stone houses, the cold reluctant to release its grip even as the gardens outside began to bloom. But in Josie's room, warmth had long since taken permanent residence. The transformation was, by any measure, complete. The walls glowed warm cream, catching the afternoon light through curtains she'd sewn herself. The cast-iron stove kept the space comfortable through even the last stubborn cold snaps. Books filled the shelf she'd built and sanded by hand, their spines cracked and well-loved. Photographs lined the dresser now, not just the single frame of her parents from those early days, but new ones too. Rosa laughing over a batch of bread dough, Pietro proudly standing beside a rose bush he'd been nursing back to health, even one, taken by Rosa without either of their knowledge, of Josie and Dante sitting together on the small porch swing that had appeared outside her window sometime in early March, a gift Dante had commissioned without telling her, simply because he'd noticed her admiring one in a catalog months before. The quilt still covered the bed, softer now with use, its patchwork squares faded gently from sunlight. The desk beneath the window held not paint swatches anymore, but a growing collection of sketches, plans for a small vegetable garden Josie hoped to start behind the greenhouse once the last frost passed. It was, in every sense that mattered, a home. Her home, built one careful repair at a time, out of a room nobody else had wanted. By early summer, the vegetable garden Josie had sketched in seed packet diagrams through the last cold weeks of spring had become a real, growing thing. Rows of tomatoes staked with old broom handles, beans climbing a trellis Pietro had helped her build from scrap lumber left over from a fence repair. It sat behind the greenhouse, out of sight of the mansion's more formal gardens, a small, unglamorous patch of dirt that belonged entirely to her. She was out there most mornings before the heat set in, kneeling in the soil in an old pair of jeans that had survived every phase of the room's renovation, when Rosa came to find her one Tuesday, with an expression Josie had learned to take seriously. "Your mother is on the phone," Rosa said. "She says it isn't urgent, but I think she's being polite." Josie's stomach dropped anyway. Old habits, built over years of watching her family's finances teeter on the edge of collapse, didn't unlearn themselves overnight. She wiped her hands on her jeans and hurried inside, taking the call in the kitchen while Rosa discreetly busied herself with a pot of simmering sauce. "Mom, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," her mother said quickly, and Josie could hear the smile in her voice even through the phone. "Your father wanted me to call. We're doing well, Josie. Better than well. The company picked up 2 new contracts this month, real ones, nothing we had to borrow against. He says it feels like breathing again." Josie sank into a kitchen chair, relief loosening something in her chest that had been tight for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like when it wasn't. "That's wonderful, Mom." "He wanted me to thank you," her mother continued, her voice growing softer, "for what you did. He still has trouble saying it himself. You know how he gets. But he said if it weren't for you, none of this would have been possible. The house, the company, any of it." "I didn't do it alone," Josie said, glancing through the kitchen window toward the garden and beyond it toward the north wing where her window caught the morning light. "I had help I didn't expect to get." "Is he good to you?" her mother asked, the question careful, the way a parent asks something they're afraid to hear the wrong answer to. "Dante, is he good to you, Josie?" Josie thought about the cold room she'd walked into 8 months earlier and the warm one she lived in now. She thought about a man who had learned, slowly and against everything his upbringing had taught him, how to apologize, how to bring her small, useful gifts instead of grand, empty ones, how to stand in a doorway and simply watch her work instead of demanding her attention. "He's good to me," Josie said, and she meant it in a way she hadn't quite expected to. "He's still learning how, but he's trying, Mom. That counts for a lot more than people think it does." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Your father wants to visit, see the place for himself, see you." "I'd like that," Josie said, surprised by how much she meant it. "I want to show you the garden." "A garden," her mother repeated, something wistful in her voice. "You always did take after your grandmother that way. She could grow anything out of nothing." After she hung up, Josie sat in the kitchen for a long moment, watching steam curl up from Rosa's simmering pot, feeling the strange, quiet happiness of a problem that had finally, fully resolved itself. Her father's business was recovering, her family was safe, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, without either of them quite realizing when it happened, she had built herself a life she didn't want to leave. She found Dante later that evening on the porch swing outside her window, a folder of paperwork forgotten beside him, his eyes fixed on the last light fading over the garden. "My parents want to visit," she said, sitting down beside him. "Good," Dante said, without hesitation. "I'd like to meet the man who taught you how to patch a ceiling crack." "He'll probably lecture you about proper drainage," Josie warned. "He's very particular about drainage." "I look forward to it," Dante said, and the corner of his mouth curved into the easy, unguarded smile that had become, over the months, entirely familiar to her. Josie leaned into his shoulder, watching the light fade gold and then blue over the rows of tomatoes she'd planted with her own hands, and thought that this, more than any of the marble or the chandeliers or the careful staff who kept the mansion running like a machine, was what it meant to actually own a place. Not the deed, not the name on the mailbox, the dirt under your fingernails, the walls you'd patched yourself, the people who came to sit beside you at the end of the day because they wanted to, not because they were told to. Dante found her there on a warm evening in late April, the windows open for the first time since winter, letting in the smell of blooming roses from Pietro's garden below. She was sitting on the floor, surrounded by seed packets, sorting them by planting date with the careful focus she brought to everything she cared about. "I have something for you," Dante said, and there was an uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice that made Josie look up immediately, sensing something different in the air. He held out a small velvet box, and for a moment, Josie's heart stumbled, old fears about the nature of their arrangement rising briefly before she caught the expression on his face. None of the cold formality of their wedding day, only something warm and slightly uncertain, the expression of a man who had learned, slowly and against every instinct his upbringing had given him, how to hope for something he wasn't sure he deserved. Inside the box was a ring, simple and elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewelry that lined the cases of the shops Rosa had once pointed out to her in town. It was a thin band of gold, set with a single small stone the color of the cream walls that surrounded them. "I know we already have rings," Dante said, his voice rougher than usual. "The ones from the wedding, but those felt like they belonged to an arrangement. I wanted you to have something that belonged to us instead, to this." He gestured around the room, at the walls she'd painted, the stove she'd installed, the quilt she'd found at a rummage sale months before either of them had known this room would become something worth protecting. "Josie," Dante said, and his voice, usually so carefully controlled, wavered slightly around her name. I gave you the coldest room in this house because I wasn't paying attention, because I'd stopped believing anything in my life could be warm. You didn't just fix a room. You showed me what it looks like to choose to build something, even when nobody expects you to, even when it would be easier to just accept the cold. Josie set down her seed packets, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for his. I fell in love with you somewhere between the spackle and the paint, Dante continued, a rare, unguarded smile breaking across his face. I don't know exactly when. I just know that every time I walked down this hallway and saw light under your door, it started to feel less like checking on an arrangement and more like coming home. Dante, Josie said softly, I think I fell in love with you the night you apologized for the room. It wasn't a big apology, but it was the first honest thing you'd ever said to me. He laughed, the sound low and warm, and pulled her gently to her feet, the seed packets forgotten on the floor around them. Marry me again, he said. Not because of a debt, not because of an arrangement, because I choose you, Josie, because you turned the coldest place in this house into the only room I ever want to come home to. I already married you once, Josie pointed out, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Marry me because you want to, Dante said. That's all I'm asking. Josie looked around the room, at every careful, imperfect repair she'd made with her own 2 hands, at the life she'd built out of nothing but stubbornness and paint and patience. And then she looked at the man standing in front of her, the cold, guarded stranger who had slowly, over months of quiet evenings and small, honest conversations, become someone she couldn't imagine her life without. Yes, she said, I want to. He slid the ring onto her finger, and outside the window, the last of the evening light caught the warm cream walls, filling the room with a glow that had nothing to do with the sunset and everything to do with everything Josie had built inside it. They were married again 3 months later, in the same small chapel where their first ceremony had taken place, but this time, the room was filled with warmth instead of formality. Rosa cried openly through the vows, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she'd embroidered herself for the occasion. Pietro stood proudly near the back, having personally grown every flower that filled the chapel that day. Josie's parents attended too, her father's eyes bright with a relief and happiness that had nothing to do with debts forgiven, and everything to do with watching his daughter marry a man who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. When Dante kissed her this time, it wasn't a careful, formal brush against her cheek. It was warm and real and entirely his choice. That night, they didn't retreat to separate corners of the mansion. They sat together in the room that had once been cold and forgotten, now filled with everything Josie had built, everything they'd built together in the months since, and talked quietly about the future, about the vegetable garden that had finally taken root behind the greenhouse, about small plans for other neglected corners of the house that might someday, with enough patience, become warm too. You know, Dante said, his arm around her shoulders as they sat together on the small porch swing outside her window, watching the stars come out over the estate. My father always said sentiment was a weakness in this family. What do you think now? Josie asked. Dante was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything that mattered to him. I think my father never understood the difference between softness and strength, he said finally. It takes strength to build something warm in a cold place. I didn't understand that until I watched you do it, one crack at a time, without ever once asking for help you didn't need. Josie leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the light from her window spill warm and golden across the garden below, and thought about the girl who had walked into a broken, freezing room on her wedding night and refused to let it stay that way. That autumn, Almost a year to the day since Josie had first walked into a cracked, freezing room on her wedding night, Rosa organized a small harvest supper in the garden Josie had built behind the greenhouse. It wasn't a grand affair. No crystal, no formal seating chart, just long wooden tables dragged out from the kitchen storage and covered in mismatched cloths. Strings of small lights Pietro had wound through the trellis where the beans still climbed. Josie's parents came, her father walking slower than he used to but standing straighter, the gray that had settled into his face during the worst of the company's troubles finally starting to fade. He spent nearly an hour with Dante, examining the drainage system Josie had installed along the garden's edge. The two of them crouched over a length of pipe like old friends comparing notes, and Josie watched them from the porch swing with an ache in her chest that had nothing to do with sadness. "He likes him," her mother said, settling beside her. "Your father, he was so afraid that first year that you'd married into something cold. I think he's finally starting to believe he was wrong." "He wasn't entirely wrong," Josie admitted. "It was cold. For a while." "And now?" Josie looked toward the mansion, toward the small, warm square of light in the north wing where her window sat, glowing gold even from this distance, the porch swing outside it catching the last of the evening sun. "Now it isn't," she said simply. Later, after the plates had been cleared and Rosa had shooed everyone away from the dishes with the stern insistence of a woman who considered cleanup her own particular territory, Dante found Josie alone by the trellis, running her fingers along a bean pod that had finally grown heavy enough to pick. "Your father asked me today if I knew how lucky I was," Dante said, coming to stand beside her. "What did you tell him?" "That I know exactly how lucky I am," Dante said. "That I've known since the first night I stood in a doorway and saw light where I expected only cold." Josie smiled, tucking the bean pod into her apron pocket, and let him take her hand as the last of the string lights flickered on overhead, warm and steady against the coming dark. Some rooms, she'd learned, weren't meant to be endured. They were meant to be rebuilt, patiently, stubbornly, one honest repair at a time, until the coldest place in the whole house became the warmest one instead. And sometimes, if you were patient enough, the person who gave you that cold room learned to rebuild himself right alongside it. What started as the coldest, most broken room in the Rossetti mansion became the warmest heart of the entire house. And in rebuilding it, Josie rebuilt something in Dante too, something his family's cold business had nearly convinced him he didn't deserve. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't fighting back. It's picking up a paintbrush and refusing to let the cold win. What do you think? Would you have done the same thing Josie did, or packed your bags the moment you saw that room? Let us know in the comments below. If this slow-burn, heartfelt story warmed you up the way it warmed up that mansion, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good redemption story, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales of love found in the most unexpected places. See you in the next one.